was a dog with boundless curiosity, his paws steady on the ground. He wasn't just any dog. He was a Doberman with sleek black fur and eyes that held a quiet intensity. His days were spent in the peaceful countryside, where the sun stretched lazily across the hills and the leaves of the trees swayed gently with the breeze. Duke lived with David, his kind and adventurous owner, in a cozy house that felt like a home, not just for them, but for all the animals that came to visit. Duke's world was full of joy, but there was one thing that always seemed to elude him: the sky. Every day he would sit outside, his gaze fixed on the horizon, where birds soared effortlessly, their wings cutting through the air like knives through soft clouds. He watched them with awe, his ears perked, his body still. He would wag his tail in excitement, as if urging them to come closer. But no matter how much he barked or leaped, they were always too far away. When the birds flew in flocks, Duke's excitement would grow even more. He would run in circles, chasing them with all his might, but the wind in his face and the sky above him only made him feel more distant from the freedom he longed to have. His legs carried him swiftly across the fields, but they could never take him high enough to join the birds in their graceful dance. And as the birds disappeared into the distance, Duke would sit down, exhausted and frustrated, his head low. There was a sadness in his eyes, a longing for something he could never reach. David noticed this, of course. He would often catch Duke staring at the birds with a look of deep thought, his tail swishing slowly back and forth, as if contemplating the impossible. David would smile softly to himself, knowing how much Duke adored the sky, but he didn't fully understand why. Was it simply the sight of the birds flying, or did Duke wish he could join them? Was his loyal companion dreaming of something greater than just being a dog on the ground? One day, while David sat outside with Duke, they were joined by their neighbor, Sophia. She had seen Duke's fascination with the birds and had often commented on how curious the dog was about the sky. As they watched a large flock of birds glide above them, Sophia turned to David with an idea. "You know," she said thoughtfully, "I think Duke really wants to fly. Have you ever thought about letting him experience it?" David looked at her, puzzled at first. He had never considered that a dog might want to fly. But as he looked back at Duke, his eyes full of wonder as he watched the birds, the thought began to take root. Maybe Duke needed to know what it felt like to soar, even if just for a moment. "What if we took him up in the plane?" David asked, his voice tentative. He owned a small light aircraft, something he had used on many occasions for adventures and to explore the open sky. The idea of sharing that with Duke seemed wild, but maybe it was exactly what the dog needed. Sophia smiled, her eyes twinkling. "I think it could be just what he's been waiting for. After all, dogs like Duke are always curious about the world. Maybe flying is the answer to what he's been dreaming of." The next weekend, with the excitement of the plan buzzing between them, David, Sophia, and Duke made their way to the small airfield nearby. Duke, unaware of what was about to happen, trotted alongside David, his ears perked with anticipation. He had no idea where they were going, but the scent of adventure was in the air, and it filled him with an unfamiliar thrill. When they reached the plane, Duke stopped, his eyes widening as he saw the shiny metal wings. The plane looked so different from anything he'd seen before. David gently patted Duke's head, giving him a reassuring smile as he led him inside. Sophia, who had never been in the plane before, joined them, ready to witness the adventure unfold. David started the engine, and the plane's gentle rumble filled the air. Duke's tail wagged, but he felt a little uncertain. This wasn't like anything he had ever experienced. The engine roared to life, and as the plane began to move down the runway, Duke's paws instinctively gripped the seat beneath him. His ears flattened against the sound, and his eyes darted around as the ground seemed to vanish beneath them. At first, Duke was confused. He had never felt this sensation before. The sudden lifting off the ground, the way his stomach flipped as the world tilted upward. But then, As the plane rose higher and higher, Duke's confusion turned to awe. The birds were no longer just specks in the sky. They were close, so close, that Duke could see their wings flapping, their feathers shimmering in the sunlight. He stared out of the window, his eyes wide with wonder. He could almost feel the wind beneath him, could almost imagine himself flying like them. But as the plane soared higher, something inside Duke changed. The ground below him looked so far away. His heart began to race, his paws pressing against the sides of the plane. The vastness of the world beneath him made him feel small, fragile, and alone. He turned his head, his eyes desperately seeking the comfort of the earth he had always known. The world around him seemed to spin, and a wave of panic swept over him. This wasn't what he had imagined. The sky, so full of freedom, now felt suffocating, like a cage. Duke whimpered softly, his body tense, his breath quickening. The birds that had once seemed so majestic now felt like distant strangers, flying in a world he couldn't reach. He wanted to return to the ground, to the safety of solid earth beneath his paws. But the plane kept climbing, and he could do nothing but watch in helpless fear. David and Sophia noticed the change in Duke. David looked over at Sophia, his voice gentle, but filled with concern. "I think we need to bring him down." Sophia nodded, her expression serious. "We're too high now. Let's head back to the ground." As the plane slowly began to descend, Duke's relief was immediate. He pressed his paws against the seat, his eyes fixed on the ground that was getting closer and closer. The fear still gripped him, but with each passing second, it lessened. The world below seemed familiar, comforting, and safe. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the plane touched down. Duke jumped out the moment it stopped, his paws barely touching the earth before he sprinted away, his legs trembling with exhaustion. He ran in circles, his breath heavy and quick, as if trying to shake the experience from his body. The grass beneath his paws felt solid and real, and he stayed there for a long time, feeling the earth beneath him, grounding him, until his heart stopped racing. For the next few days, Duke was quieter than usual. He avoided looking up at the birds, no longer feeling the same longing in his heart. Instead, he stayed close to David, his paws planted firmly on the ground. He had learned something important, something he couldn't quite put into words. The sky, though beautiful, was not meant for him. He had his own place in the world, and it was here, on the ground, with David. David and Sophia noticed the change in Duke. They watched as he began to enjoy his walks again, his tail wagging with contentment as he played fetch and explored the world at his feet. He no longer looked at the sky with longing, but with quiet curiosity. The birds, once objects of envy, were now simply part of the world around him. One afternoon, David decided to take Duke on another short flight. This time, Duke didn't bark with excitement or fear. He simply sat quietly beside David, enjoying the experience for what it was. He looked out of the window at the birds, but this time, he didn't long to join them. Instead, he watched them with interest, understanding that they were free in their own way, just as he was free to walk the earth. Duke had finally understood. He was meant to walk the earth, not fly through the sky, and that was enough for him.